In this video, we'll look at decal image textures. A common occurrence is the need to overlay one texture over another in a scene. This is usually referred to as decaling. To demonstrate decal textures, I'll start with a new scene, and I'll go ahead and delete the cube. I'll add a plane and scale it up a bit so it's easier to see. I'll also select my lamp in the Object Data tab, and I'm going to increase my lamp energy to 3 just to brighten things up a bit. And then lastly, I'll pull open a render window. There are a couple of ways to add decal textures. Like the early modeling videos, paying attention to the degrees that we're using can go a long way to making some of the methods easier to do. With that said, I'll rotate my plane by hitting R, then Y for the axis, then 90 and enter, so that my plane is at exactly 90 degrees. With my plane selected, I'll go to the Material tab and create a new material, and I'll call it Brick Wall. Then I'll go to my Texture tab and create a new texture, and we'll call this Bricks. We'll open our file browser, and we'll grab the brick texture that we used in previous videos. Now let's go down and change our mapping to generated coordinates. And in image sampling, let's check our Flip XY checkbox and render. Alright, we have a nice brick wall to start with. If you're just hopping into this video, you did both of these things so that you got this nice render, and if you undo both of those things, you'll get a chance to see how not alright it would have looked. Alright, before we move on, it should be noted that I'm going to be using two textures from cgtextures.com. Now, I can't include these in the assets due to licensing, but I'm using a couple of different textures, a grunge decal and a sign decal. You can get these or similar decals from CG Textures for free. I highly recommend them as one of your go-to texture sources. If you need to, pause here and go check them out. Again, that's cgtextures.com. Alright, I'll select the second texture slot and hit New. I'll open my browser, and I'm going to select, in my case, the Decal Bottom JPEG. This is my grunge texture. If we render, we can see a familiar problem. However, this time I don't want to simply change to generated coordinates, as it will limit what I can do. This time we'll have to UV map our plane to get the results that I want to get. Since this is a single face plane, UVing will be pretty simple. It should be noted that our brick texture is using generated mapping, and that's okay. It won't be affected by mapping our other texture. I'll go to my perspective window and hit Tab to go into edit mode. I'll then hit the hotkey U to bring up my UV panel and simply select Unwrap. For the single poly plane, that's all we need to do. However, now if we render, we can see we still have some fixing to do. Our decal is on its side, and it extends the entire length of the wall. I only want it creeping up the bottom half. Now in my render window, I'll go to my ID dropdown, and I'll select my bottom decal. The problem is that our decal is stretched over the entire plane, which is why the plane doesn't appear square. And our UV map is on its side, which isn't apparent at all, but we can tell from our render what we need to do. So first, let's get our UV map turned the right way. I'll hit R for rotate, and I'll type in 90 and enter. That will turn our UV map on its side. I'll then hit G for grab and just move the map so that my decal sits at the bottom. Last, we want to size the UV map to fit this decal in the X coordinate. I'll hit Control-Tab and select Edge. Then I'll go ahead and right-click to select my right edge. I'll then hit G for grab and X to lock my direction, and then I'll pull my edge over to the edge of the texture. I'll repeat this on the left side by selecting that edge and hitting G and X, and then pulling it left till I get to that edge of the texture. Alright, I'll then return to my render result and go ahead and render. Alright, now our texture is where I want it, but it's tiling, which I don't want it to do. We can fix this in our mapping panel by changing our extension from repeat to clip. Now if we render once again, we have a nice grunge decal over our brick wall. Now I can see a little bit of edge showing at the bottom, which looks pretty unnatural. We can fix this by returning to our texture image and adjusting our UVs a little. This time selecting the bottom edge and hitting G for grab, and this time Y to lock vertically, and just moving that bottom edge up a bit until it's aligned. Alright, let's go back to our render result and re-render. That's better. I just wanted to demonstrate that you can go back and make fine adjustments as much as you need to in order to get the result that you want. If we look in our texture window, we can see that both of our textures are checked. If I uncheck the bottom texture and render, it disappears from the render. I'll recheck it and I'll render again. Now, when stacking textures in this manner, you just need to be aware that Blender renders from top to bottom. So be sure your textures are in the proper order in the stack to get the result that you want. Alright, let's take a look at another method for creating a decal. I'll select the third texture slot and create a new texture called Sign. I'll go ahead and click Open to open up my file browser again. And I'll select my sign texture and open that up. I'll scroll down and I'll change from repeat to clip so it doesn't tile, because we already know we don't want it to do that. Alright, now in my perspective window, I'll hit Shift S and then cursor to selected. In this case, my cursor was already centered because I've never moved it, but it's just a good habit to do when you want to create geometry on top of other geometry. I'll tab back to object mode and then hit Shift A so that I can create an empty object, and the style I'm going to choose is arrows. Alright, now I'm going to come down here and turn off my manipulator widget just so things are a little easier to see. I'll select my plane, and back in my texture panel, I'll change my mapping coordinates from UV to object. In the drop down beneath it, I'll select my empty object. As a side note, you should name your empty object to something that makes sense. Now, on our empty object, we can see all three of our axes. By default, Blender will render along the Z-axis, and think of that Z-axis as poking through your texture. As the Z-axis is pointing up, if we render, we can see that our texture decal is rendered just stretched way out of whack. So we need our Z-axis to point out from our brick wall. That's not too bad to do. We'll go back to our perspective window, and with our empty object selected, I'll first follow my own advice, hit N, and then I'm going to rename my object to Danger Object. It was just really starting to bother me that that was just empty. Alright, then I'll hit R for rotate and Y, and then 90 enter to rotate my object to the same orientation as my plane. This is why we want to remember what manipulations we made and use specific values instead of just guessing at it. Alright, let's render. It's better. Alright, now let's hit R to rotate and X and 90 enter, and then try rendering again. Okay, we're right side up, but I want it to be smaller and in the upper corner. Smaller's pretty easy. We'll just hit S for scale and scale it down a bit. Let's render once more. Alright, maybe adjust that a bit and render again. That's good. Now, to move my object without screwing up its position to the plane, I'll hit G for grab, and then Shift X to lock out my X axis, and then slide my object up to the corner and render. That'll do. Also, as a side note, notice that the object handles are roughly the same size as the decal that you're using, or the texture that you're using. You can use this as a guide when making placements. Lastly, there is a third way to do decals, and I'm a little reticent to tell you about it, but you may run into some situations where it works better. But that's simply to create another plane with the texture you want and put it just over the surface you want it on. And as we're going through this, you may have thought about that and wondered why we weren't doing it. Here's why I don't recommend it. There's a few reasons. First of all, it only works well with flat objects or with objects that have exactly the same geometry. Secondly, it takes more rendering power once you have that extra geometry in there, especially if the decal has an alpha channel, so that there's lots of area that needs to be calculated but not rendered. And thirdly, it's just really hard to get it right and get it to look just right. I highly recommend staying with these two methods in every situation possible. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll go ahead and see you in the next one.